So I'm Zulema Valdez. I'm the professor of sociology at UC Merced and also the associate vice provost for the faculty. And that's a position I've held for about 3 years. Yeah, and I've been at UC Merced for about 7 years now and came from Texas A&M University where I started my career.
Well, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. And I should also say that Zulema and I went to grad school together, and we were just talking about how long it's been since we've seen each other. I think just a few years after we both graduated, we ran into each other in Ann Arbor at a restaurant.
That's right.
Had coffee or something. But Zulema and I were in this seminar called 237, which was a really interdisciplinary group, although its home was in sociology, run by the wonderful Rebecca Jean Imai, who was both of our advisors. And it was this kind of famous seminar because you went in and you didn't present anything, you just sat there. And Rebecca would have all of us, she would force us, this was part of our practice, to learn how to ask academic questions, ask a round of questions. And then as the speaker, you had to just take notes on all the questions and then answer, and then another round. And it was a lot of fun. And over the years, we would present our work. And that was this big rite of passage when you got up in front of the firing squad and gave your paper. Yeah. So hopefully this will feel familiar in that regard, but not like a firing squad. Just
it won't be traumatic. Yes, it was back at the time, because that was so hardcore. And I don't know if you remember, but there was more than one guest that would be in tears in a bathroom or something like that afterwards, because it was pretty grueling, because you were expected to answer questions to a reading that people had 1 week in advance, and that was it. Right. There was no other thing happening. So,
yes. Yeah. And it was a long hour and a half or however long.
It was.
Yeah.
Hardcore.
Yes.
Good times.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just start by asking how you got interested in this topic.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So, as you noted, I was at UCLA as a graduate student. And even in my undergraduate years, I was at UCLA as well. And I was taking some courses from, Roger Waldinger and Ivan Light, who are kind of the foundational scholars in this area of ethnic and immigrant entrepreneurship. And so even as an undergraduate, I was reading articles and works about immigrant entrepreneurs that didn't really resonate with the entrepreneurs or the immigrant self-employed folks that I knew. Most of those folks were struggling mightily, may have not, succeeded in terms of economic progress and mobility. Most were not talked about in the literature, which was really geared towards this whole kind of almost what we would call today respectability politics around immigrant dreams of America and this rugged determination to start anew in this new place and beyond all, obstacles, be very successful. And that just did not resonate with the experience that I had, which was that I grew up in a Mexican American community in Fresno, California, in the Central Valley. Many of my family members were in the construction industry and things like that. And a lot of my cousins and friends would be working with these folks. So in some ways, it was, this sounds like ethnic entrepreneurship, where you're creating social capital and there's some cohesion between immigrants who have their kids working with them. And it sort of sounded like it, but it was rarely did it lead to dramatic, economic mobility. And in some ways, I didn't understand why those kinds of businesses, performed by groups that were not entrepreneurial in the sense of the percentage of people who were involved in it, and not to mention the people who are not being considered in the informal economy. And we're talking about here, oranges being sold on the street corners, or in swap meets, or people cleaning your house who are also, self-employed. And all of those were not being kind of captured in this kind of spirit of entrepreneurialism. So I found that was an area that I wanted to kind of work into and think about. And that was kind of my contribution to that field at that time. Just this kind of like, let me talk about the groups that are not talked about. Let me talk about the groups that are not considered entrepreneurial, of which Mexican Americans and Black Americans were at that time, right? Not considered entrepreneurial in that sense. Cubans were the only Latin or American origin group that was kind of in that space, along with Chinese, Japanese, American and immigrant groups, and they were kind of taking all of the oxygen out of the room. And it was written by these people who were kind of like committed to this kind of ideology of entrepreneurship, and it just did not resonate with me. And I was looking kind of at this other direction, and that was kind of the way that I kind of came into it.
So I want to start with, let's explore some of that foundational research, and then we'll pivot to the work that you did and how you contributed to that research. But in that foundational set of writings by Ivan Light and Waldinger and others, there's this discussion of the role of the ethnic enclave and how that creates this springboard or foundation for ethnic entrepreneurship that catapults these communities, particular communities who utilize it effectively, into higher levels of economic prosperity. Tell us a little bit about this whole argument about the role of the ethnic enclave.
Right. So one of the things that this whole literature underscored is the notion of group cohesion and solidarity, so that you were relying on your co-ethnic community for support in order to generate the resources that you needed to start a business, but also the business itself in an enclave might have been specific to the needs, the food, the kind of things that an immigrant community used. And so they could cater to that immigrant clientele and provide that service in the enclave without really even needing to, learn the new language or even go beyond kind of what your community preferences are, and those kinds of things. But the reason why I take a pretty critical view of even the enclave literature is because there is always a cultural kind of foundation in this work when we're talking about whose enclave matters for generating resources that can then springboard into a business. When we think about the work at that time, okay, so I want to kind of also remember that kind of historical period in which people were writing about culture and the salience of culture for immigrant and ethnic entrepreneurs, which those conversations were not happening about white entrepreneurs or American white entrepreneurs. We were not talking about their cohesive communities that were generating resources that could springboard their businesses. But believe you me, white folks have networks that helped them generate businesses, and those are wildly successful and more successful than any immigrant group we would talk about today. And the opposite also is true, that are we saying then there are some communities that are also segregated communities as opposed to the literature's preference for community building? There are, at that time, people were talking about culture of poverty, right? So ghettos or concentrated areas of poverty, akin to what William Julius Wilson was talking about in The Declining Significance of Race, where when we talk about those communities, they were not talked about as generating resources and community solidarity. They were considered and characterized as isolated communities, devoid of entrepreneurial opportunities, and not having the resources to get over and start a business, right? And in fact, those communities often had immigrant entrepreneurs, middleman minorities who would go into Black communities and serve that purpose of those kind of small businesses in those areas. So there, for me, there was this real, the salience of culture, the salience of ethnicity in talking about an enclave that would then be generative for business was a cultural argument, and one that I had a lot of problems with because I didn't think that it really identified what the problem was in businesses that are not, right, that or groups that are not having that same enclave effect. Basically that they didn't have the access to resources or capital that was necessary to be able to springboard. And I'll give you one example of that is this idea of a rotating credit association, right? Which a lot of different books and articles have written about this idea that there are these immigrant communities and based purely on the solidaristic traits that they see in each other. They're from the same village, or they're from the same town, or they speak the same language, that they would trust each other, enforceable trust to all contribute to a rotating credit association, which would provide a good sum of money that they could then take and use for a business. That whole idea is predicated on being able to come up with the resources to even launch a rotating credit association, some of which started with about $10,000 each person, right? Mm-hmm. Most of the people in the Black community or the Mexican American community were like, $10,000. If I had $10,000, I would already have a business. I don't need to have a rotating credit association to generate, that would have been sufficient. So the fact that there's unequal resources that some groups and some communities could use for a business, that's the whole kind of cultural layer that is embedded in ideas of the enclave. And if you are not able to do that, if you're not able to gather the resources necessary from co-ethnics, then it's not an enclave. Then it's something else. Right? It's a ghetto, or it's a barrio. It's not an enclave, because that doesn't fit. Mm-hmm. So it's the discourse around that is what I find problematic. Now, if somebody wants to say, yeah, but it's true, they had rotating credit associations and they did have small business owners, and we see, right, we see Chinatown, we see Koreatown, we see how that worked. Yes, there was a disproportionate number of business owners from those particular communities, but you can root that not in some kind of cultural orientation, but really kind of an access to resources. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my whole pitch.
And you began, so would you say that the work that was done focusing on, you saw how long my notes were, so it's going to take me a minute to find my point. The kind of process of migration, the pre-migration, was that mirroring your critique that then there's this intervention, that there is this kind of modality of a mode of what you brought with you before you migrated, the opportunity structure you were met with once you arrived, that contributed to that success or not, or that entrepreneurial orientation or not?
Yeah, so that yeah, and I think that that's right. So when I was, kind of involved in reading all these materials about particular immigrant and ethnic groups that were quote unquote successful because they had disproportionate rates of self-employment compared to US born Native counterparts or whites, right, that was the example was that the cultural part of it is a salient feature of the ability to go into entrepreneurship. And then some folks were starting to talk about, and this was also the same folks, I want to give them their due, right? Ivan Light, Portes and Bach and Portes and Joe and Roger Waldinger were all starting to talk about what they were considered like the opportunity structure of the economy. That would be Roger Waldinger's work. And Portes was talking about modes of incorporation, which has to do with kind of a combination of the economic context in which a person is being dropped into, plus like labor market opportunities, plus right the ethnic group community factor, right? And so what happened was there started to be a development of multiple forces at play that could be mixed and matched in particular ways to explain one group or another's success. And so that seemed to be, it is a bit more comprehensive in that it's not just pushing the culture line so hard, but it also required the cultural piece. And that's the part where, I mean, I really struggle with it in my climate change work that I'm doing right now. I'm looking at a small rural white town, and the culture piece is everywhere. I mean, that's all anybody talks about, right? Is the cultural piece that explains the Trumpers or the climate deniers or the anti-vaxxers, and it all kind of reduces down to culture. But I find that to be I'm not convinced that that is what is really going on and driving people's kinds of decision making or discourse around particular things that they do or not do. So taking that kind of approach, even when you're thinking about, well, it's a hodgepodge of factors, right? I mean, do you move into a community where there's co-ethnic solidarity? Are you coming with legal status? So if you're, say, for example, you come in as a migrant community that has refugee status, or you come in as a legal permanent resident, these kinds of statuses can help you in a way that if you're coming, say, undocumented across the border, you don't have access to those kinds of resources. So, we're looking about those pro-migration characteristics, also the ways in which you incorporate into a community, whether there is a professional class of refugee co-ethnics in the community. All these kind of things matter. But I also kind of thought, well, if we have a whole list of things that we need to think about that mix and match in particular ways to predict successful entrepreneurship, that's not really a theory. It's more of a model, or it's a framework for explaining it. But you're kind of looking in the rearview mirror all the time and saying, oh, well, they do have this. Oh, they did live there. And oh, they were this category of citizen, or, and so it's kind of like, it's not predictive. It's explanatory, but it's not predictive. And in that way, it's not really a theory of entrepreneurship. It's much more of a framework or a model to explain the entrepreneurship that you're looking at. Okay.
I want to turn to your 2015 article, which I thought was just so interesting in thinking about one of these kind of fundamental arguments in the ethnic entrepreneurship literature, which is this ability to sort of, take advantage and employ co-ethnics, or the kind of resources that are available within that enclave community. And you really target on the household labor and the class and gender dynamics to help us see underneath that category of resource sharing to those sort of gendered and class dynamics that complicate and diversify the experiences that you might have with that. So let's talk about that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the database that you were working with. It was an oral history project?
Yeah, so that was really great. It was an oral history project, and I believe the project lead was named Christine Navarro, and it was through UTEP, so the University of Texas at El Paso. And they had this project where they had used and hired, or it was a class of undergraduates who were doing community engaged research, identifying business owners in the community of El Paso, and then doing these oral histories and collecting all of the information about how they kind of like came to the United States, or their family did, and what they did, and how they got into owning a business, and then how were they doing in the business, and those kinds of questions. So it's a really amazing database. And I have been invited to present some of my work at UTEP and met Christine Navarro and heard about the Oral History Project. And I was like, listen, this is really good data because it's looking at middle-class Mexican-American business owners in El Paso. Like, that's beautiful data. And I've always been jealous of good data. When I hear about it, I get really jealous of good data. So I went over there and I was learning about this Oral History Project and I was just blown away. I was like, I have to get my hands on this, but also kind of help, I wanted to learn more. So I'd met a handful of those business owners at that event and talked to Christine Navarro, who was doing another round of interviews. And so I said, I'd really love it if you could ask these questions as well. And so they're very generous with allowing me to kind of give them a few questions and actually have access to the data and use the data. So that was and it was amazing too, because I was thinking, well, let me write papers with y'all. Like, we can do this all as a community project. But they weren't set up for that at that time. I mean, it's funny now that I think about it, because I was thinking we should have written papers with multiple authors who did the interviews, right? That's reflexivity. I mean, that's kind of what we should be doing. But they were doing lots of different projects, and they're just saying, oh no, we just have these oral histories. They're just going to be made available at this site, and anybody can listen to them. And, here they are. And I got, essentially a zipped folder with all of them in there. So what was I to do except take them and thank them in the acknowledgments? But that was basically how far it went. So given this really rich data about, and having met them and also having been able to add a couple of questions, what was really interesting about that data was that it was a Mexican-American group of middle class, right, educated business owners, to really disentangle the idea that a Mexican American business owner is always a survival strategy entrepreneur, right? Is either the fruit vendor or the domestic worker and the gardener, and instead these were people who owned engineering firms, or had who were doing kind of personal services, and starting businesses about that were related to their education, basically their skills in education, or their BA or their MBA. So I loved the data and I wanted to really kind of get into it. But what I was struck with immediately was, here's a group of folks who are middle class doing all the right things, and how do they think about entrepreneurship for their families or passing it on? And right away, what I looked at and what was really coming through was the women were, if they were a business owner, they were the business owner. There wasn't the same kind of familial support for the business. They may or may not have had their kids working for free in the business. Their partner, husband, and it was quite, heteronormative. The husband would have a different business that they were doing, not their own self-employment business, but they had an employee gig somewhere. But if you were looking at a male business owner, his wife was inevitably working in the business in some capacity, whether like doing the books or taking care of the customer base or whatever. And the children were asked to do what we know is like family unpaid labor. So right away, there seemed to be this, if a woman is a business owner, she's doing it on her own. And if a man is doing business, his whole entire family is involved, but he still gets to be the owner of the business. And it's not considered, he doesn't say like it's the family business, he says it's my business. Women would say it's my family business, but they're working there by themselves. So the dynamics of gender were absolutely just very clear, as was the ideas of, if I pass down this business, my son will have it, regardless of whether it was a man who owned the business or a woman who owned the business. And if there were multiple children, the child who was identified as the one who would take over would be one of the sons. Or there were all these conditions put on the female siblings. If they were going to take care of it, then it's not just her business. She has to kind of help. It's for the family. And this also was something that I noticed when women or daughters would have a lot of education and experience in the business. And so they seem to be the one that might be the natural recipient of the businesses that would pass down. And nope, it's not going to be given to her. It's going to be given to like Johnny, who kind of flunked out of college, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen to him. So he's going to get the business. And it was very, very apparent to me that these kinds of gendered and classed about about inheritance were shaping opportunity even within a family unit about who could be entrepreneurial. And the reason why this is important is because the differences between who gets to be an entrepreneur in that kind of a family setting could be more stark than the differences between ethnic groups' success in entrepreneurship, meaning that there could be a difference between girls and boys having access to their parents' business that was larger than the differences between, say, Koreans and Latinos in being able to own a business. And looking at the family unit just created a different kind of level of analysis that wasn't at the ethnic group level. It was at the household level, and you could still see the dynamics working there that were pretty significant when you were considering those kinds of factors. And so that's why that's like at the household level, you could see how intersectionality was playing out. And my other work, you can also see how intersectionality plays out even within the ethnic entrepreneurship work and research, right? And a lot of people are like, okay, we're going to look at ethnic entrepreneurship, and at the end of the paper, we're going to throw gender in because we saw some stuff about that. And it's like, well, if we're going to think about gender as additive and we're not going to bring it into that story of ethnic entrepreneurship to begin with, and in some ways we're like identifying ethnicity as the primacy of ethnicity in that particular arrangement, we're actually missing the part that's the fused part with the gender piece, that if you looked at gender separate from ethnicity, it would also look stark in these other kinds of ways. And so just underscoring ethnicity or nativity for some kind of cultural argument was, I thought, why are you picking one over these others? I mean, gender, right? Patriarchy is something that exists in the United States and actually is more stark of a determinant of life chances than ethnicity in many, many realms. But the fact that it would be this additive thing at the end of a paper always kind of was like, why are we privileging the ethnic story or the nativity immigrant story, which of course we know why, because hashtag American dream.
You tell this really or you highlight this one story of the daughter of an entrepreneur who eventually became an entrepreneur, but it was this very windy road where she was encouraged from the middle class parenting she was encouraged to get educated, but it was only in certain kinds of industries, right? Pink collar industries, nursing or education. And so she pursued that, and marriage was very much encouraged. But then when she got divorced and then was working and then eventually found her way into entrepreneurship, and she had access to all this tacit knowledge in the family, but and some capital to help with the business, but she, like you said, she had to split some of the profits with her sisters, where then you come to find out the brothers had all gotten businesses just given to them from the parent, the father. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was a very stark example of that.
Yes, that's a really interesting, that was a really interesting story of an extremely successful Latino entrepreneur who made sure that his sons each were going to get a business that they would run. And then she had to fight very hard to have the same opportunity. And in fact, it never was the same opportunity, because even when he was finally kind of like, okay, we'll give you this one business if you want to go and try it. And then she had to kind of share the resources. So it was like a family part of the business that would be shared across other siblings. Those kinds of things, those kinds of things are real. And these are businesses that are successful, right? Many of the other businesses, if we're thinking about small business owners, small groceries, or the liquor store, kind of those classic, cleaning restaurants. These are much harder to pass on, because they don't necessarily last that long, right? So business ownership is it's a very hard thing to do, and it doesn't matter how hard you work. Sometimes it just doesn't work, right? Most businesses end in failure. So these are the ones that are doing well, and this is what it looks like, right? So,
What would you say that we've changed our mind or updated our understanding of whether ethnic entrepreneurship is a successful economic strategy? From
no,
really celebratory days, do we have a more nuanced understanding of what that pathway can do for a family? Or
I do not think so. In fact, if anything, given kind of neoliberal political and economic structural changes that we've seen post 1980s, if anything, it's gone in the opposite direction, where individuals are responsible for their own success. Austerity, and there isn't a unionization, and there's deregulation. All of these kinds of neoliberal policies have actually put more of the responsibility, right, on individuals to achieve. And we can think about like the new gig economy too, right? It's like, go get yourself a Lyft, or go do Uber, or this is the kind of thing where we're getting rid of taxis that were part of the New York apparatus were paid very well. That was a job that you could grow a family, take care of a whole family in. And we can't do that with Lyft or Uber. So we're kind of going in that direction. I'll even say what I see is a push to tell people to be entrepreneurs if they're incarcerated, right? So now, folks who are incarcerated, what are you going to do when you get out? You can own your own business. And then they start talking about, these kinds of ways of doing that, or, these ideas of a micro enterprise kind of, or a hub, or an incubator to create opportunities for small business among, disadvantaged groups, seems to be a very strong push. And I want to talk about that piece of it too, because it's important. But what I'm saying is that the idea that we could promote entrepreneurship for groups that are disadvantaged is not necessarily the way that we generate equity, or a living wage, or healthcare, safety net, 401k, 2 weeks vacation. None of this stuff happens if you're just trying to make ends meet with a small business that you're trying to launch on your own with very limited resources. That's not the thing that's going to get you to the next level. But that's the thing that people pitch. And in a neoliberal environment, it is, if you work super hard, and you don't give up, and you just keep on going, you'll be successful. But there's a whole, there's many, many, many people who are serial entrepreneurs, fail in one business, try to start another one, fail in that one, try to start another one, who are not having the experience of being able to launch a sustainable enterprise that with very limited resources and skills to start with. And I don't know why we are kind of forcing that that trajectory for someone's economic mobility. And even with the PPP, right, under COVID and all of this stuff, the businesses that are down disproportionately are minority immigrant women, right? So all of those businesses are kind of having an extremely difficult time under COVID. And in my research, I've shown that they have a disproportionately difficult time under the 2008, recession. Mm-hmm. And they had a difficult time in Houston when Katrina hit. And so these are businesses that are very vulnerable to shocks from external that can just kind of wipe it out pretty quickly. And also they're not creating wealth. So they are able to kind of sustain their own livelihood, but they're not kind of putting anything in the bank for a rainy day or to pass on to their kids. And that's just the reality of most businesses, right? So I actually think, it's gone in the other direction. That's related to a neoliberal kind of ideology that tends to dovetail so well with notions of rugged individualism, and that it's that combination is so powerful. Good luck trying to say like, hey, maybe we should be giving people a job program, trying to get them a 40-hour week in a place where they would have 2 weeks vacation and a 401k and healthcare. Right. Not to mention, I will also, now we're in this space where and I will also say that for those business owners who are successful, they're working 80 hours a week. They don't take a vacation and their kids are working in the business for free.
I was going to bring that up. You talk about this self-exploitation, even in the Korean community of entrepreneurs, which are one of those celebrated parts of this literature.
I would say, yes, that's true. Now, I also want to make sure that I don't, that it's not all bad, because one of the other things that's actually a real thing to think about is what's the alternative for these groups, right? For these people who are kind of on the margins. What's the alternative? Is the alternative to work in a minimum wage, abusive, as an employer wage worker? That's not ideal. Is it to be underemployed in the labor market, so you can't get paid for what your skill set is, or you can't find a job commensurate with your skills because maybe you don't speak a language, or maybe you had a credential in your country of origin and then you move here and that credential you can't make that credential work for you, so now you're doing this other kind of job. So there's absolutely reasons why being self-employed or starting a business may be better than the alternative if the alternative is unemployment or underemployment. And that's a real thing, right? When people make decisions about that all the time. There's also people who will say, I'm into the non-pecuniary benefits of owning a business. I don't want to be, yelled at by a boss. I want to be able to at least do something that's for me. And if I'm working 80 or 90 hours a week doing it, at least at the end of the day, I can look at myself in the mirror and feel like I've accomplished something. And that's a very real thing. But the only thing that my caveat to that is that that's usually what I get told when I'm presenting my work, is someone will stand up, whether it's a researcher in this area who doesn't like what I'm saying, or even a business owner who's like, hey, you're talking about me in this way, but I'm really happy. I feel like I've accomplished something that no one else did in my community, or I really wanted to do this for myself and I've been able to. And for that, I say, that's great. I don't want to, this isn't a false consciousness argument that I'm trying to make here. That's great. It matters. That's true. All I'm saying is the conversation around entrepreneurship as a way to economic mobility, or even on par with a regular job in the labor market, I'm not sure about that. And so I want to question that idea that successful entrepreneurship does not necessarily mean mobility. What it means is that there's a higher percentage of that particular population who's self-employed or identifies as such. That's successful, right? That's why we talk about Korean entrepreneurs who 1 out of 3 men own a business. They call that successful entrepreneurship among the Koreans. We're not talking about income. And when we do talk about income, by the way, in quantitative analyses, they take off the zero or the negative returns, right, before they run that model. So we're running a model that is $1 or more. So we've cut out all of the people who said, well, there's negative earnings this year. They're not in the model. So we've also cut out the ones quantitatively who would be showing maybe a more, accurate portrayal. No zero funds and no negative funds in that model. And we're also not accounting for hours worked. So the idea of we look at income, when we look at entrepreneurial income, we tend to look at it as the annual income. We don't look at it as an hourly wage, right? So doing the hourly amount, because if you do think about 80 hours a week, all of a sudden that $100,000 doesn't look so, great.
So thinking now about your 2008 paper, where you did have earnings as that dependent variable, right? So you were looking at economic performance and what predicted it. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of your findings as we get to the end of my list of questions and let the students hop in. So one thing was this notion of blocked mobility, right? This idea that perhaps you would turn to entrepreneurship that you were just describing because, you're somehow unable to you're underemployed, you're unable to get enough income from the labor market. You found, first of all, that that's a kind of shared, that the rates were the same across the groups that you looked at. I thought that was interesting because we have this idea that, that might be higher in some groups than others, but you show that it's about 10% of all the across white, Korean, Mexican, and Black entrepreneurs. And also that those who experienced blocked mobility as their reason for getting into entrepreneurship were higher earners in that study. Why do you suspect that might be?
Yeah, so just to talk about that study, I tried to get that study published so many times and I just got rejected at every turn, in part because it was part of my dissertation data, and that was non-public. So it was a really unique data set that allowed me to have these kinds of questions and look at it in this way. But I was very limited in what I could do to try to do more sophisticated analyses, because once I got out of the data center where it was located, I couldn't get back in. So whenever people were giving me comments about how to improve the paper, I was like, oh yeah, I'd love to do that, but I can't because I can't get the data anymore. You've got to take what I have because this is all I can do with it. So I was trying to get this paper published, and I finally did. But yeah, so I do think that there's some questions about why might blocked mobility result in better outcomes, and that's kind of what we're talking about now, right? If you're closed, if the opportunity to make economic progress in the labor market is closed, the entrepreneurial opportunity is open, but you are tending to work more than you would otherwise to make that income. So that's part of it. And again, that's also the story for a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs or ethnic business owners who face block mobility in the labor market. They can do other kinds of working conditions to get it going. And if they have kids working for free too, and if they extend their hours and things like that, it shows up in that income. So that's what I would say. I don't think it's about because we could think about a selection process, right, whereby the ones who really get screwed in the labor market turn to entrepreneurship and then they're wildly successful. But I don't necessarily think that's the truth. I think it's more that they just have more avenues to exploit their own labor or hours or family members, which allows them to get a better return. So I don't think it's anything necessarily about the experience of block mobility.
Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of talk at the time, and we're going to be looking at that actually in the class, about the role of social capital and network ties. And you have this contrast to market-based capital. you want to talk about those different pathways and sort of what your higher level conclusion was from the data that you examined, how these different nodes contribute to entrepreneurial success? So one was the social network piece, and one was access to, first of all, your own wealth and savings, and then also the ability to get capital from a market institution like a bank.
Sure, yeah. So what's really interesting about that is, who do you think is going to be successful in entrepreneurship, right? Is it the people who can rely on their co-ethnic networks that's going to generate enough resources to be successful? Or is it those who can walk into Bank of America, fill out an application for a small business loan, and get money from the bank? And the person who can get money from the bank is not the same as the person, maybe, who has personal savings, or who is borrowing from co-ethnics. So that piece of it, what I was thinking about was access to resources happens in a variety of different ways. Some of them have to do just with your own ability to save, personal savings. But some of them has to do with your credit worthiness and your ability to go out and get a loan. And some of it is going to be made based on your social networks, but let's think about those social networks, right? So if we're talking about my family, like my father, who was in the construction business, he had a lot of social networks. He had social networks all around. My cousins, my uncles, everybody was involved in the industry, but nobody could have lent him money to start a business. They could lend him their labor. He could hire them. And that was a good thing, right? Because it's hard to find good help. So he could provide my cousins with an opportunity to work. And that is a social capital resource, a trustworthy employee that you know is going to do a good job. But it wasn't the same as getting like money from your co-ethnic networks, right? And would not have had that opportunity no matter which one of my uncles he asked. That just wouldn't have generated any income or resources for business startup. If you have the ability, though, what I found in this kind of study, or at least it was alluding to it, and this is why I kind of followed up with my book, because I wanted to know this question. If you can get a bank loan, is that the first thing that you do when you want to start a business? Is the first thing that you do is say, I'm going to go to the bank and get a loan. I want to start a business. Or is the first thing you do is you go to mom and dad who are, have a nice, comfortable life and maybe some money in the bank, and you say, hey, mom and dad, can I have a loan? I want to start a business. And that one's going to be like zero interest. So it turns out that if you can have access to a bank loan, you might not need it, because if you already qualify, you could probably get it other ways. And so it's kind of the access to market resources is telling you something about their economic position, which is predictive of a successful business, because you can access money either through a bank or in other ways, whether it's personal savings or borrowing. But when you ask people, okay, and across those different groups, Mexican, Black, Korean, and white, who's borrowing from what source first? There was definitely, it's supported by the research. Yes, Korean entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs relied on their co-ethnics for resource acquisition, and it did help them start their businesses. And Latinos and Blacks were much more likely to rely on their own personal resources because they didn't qualify for a bank loan, and their social capital resources weren't generating money to start the business. But what was really interesting about the personal resources is it's a very small amount of money, right? We're talking about somebody somebody on the high end would say like, well, I worked for a while and I took all the money out of my 401k and I started this business. And I'm thinking, oh my God, the penalty for taking out money from your 401k to start a business, that's crazy. You should not do that. No one would recommend that. But if you want to start a business and you don't have any other capital, that's what you do. I knew business owners who said that they maxed out their credit cards, and that was how they did it, or they floated a check. that they couldn't cash at that time. These are ways to generate personal funds to start businesses. So what I'm saying is that if you have access to market institutions that you would qualify for a bank loan, you're already going to have a more successful business, regardless of whether you actually use it, because it is telling us that in the economic position, your economic position is already strong enough to get a loan. So there's other ways that you can use generate those funds to do it. That's kind of a marker of economic stability, right, and security. If you're using your personal savings, that might sound like a good thing. Like, wow, they have a lot of personal savings to start their own business, but it might be $5,000. It's not a lot of money. And if you're only relying on social capital from friends, family, and co-ethnics, what I showed in that article is you will start a business with that, but it doesn't necessarily predict that you're going to succeed in it. And there's reasons why, right? Because if you're not market savvy, or you're not in that position where you have that kind of knowledge and ability to, get a loan, fill out those forms, the social capital that you're using from co-ethnics may, it's helping you start a business, but it's not actually helping you keep the business. It's not helping you grow the business. It's not helping you have a good business. It's just a business, right, that you can launch. Mm-hmm. Those other things matter because they're proxies for, right, biz dev knowledge and skills and, right.
Yeah, there's a scholar I read about at the Harvard Business School. I was trying to get to come on, but he's gone into the private sector and he's working for Nike now or something. But his paper, Gareth Olds, I don't know if you came across his stuff, but he had a couple of papers of what he was calling food stamp entrepreneurs, and he was exploiting different cutoffs of around S-chip or one of the children's health insurance by state, and he was showing that even on either side of the line in the same state, you would have much more entrepreneurial activity where the safety net was more robust. And you kind of show that with the ability to whether you had a cash crisis or not was predictive of economic performance. And so there's the notion if you have some wealth to begin with, and if you have a cushion to get through cash crises, you're going to be more successful. It sort of makes sense.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what he was showing too. Very small shifts in risk support more entrepreneurship or lead people to take some of those risks. Even the $600 stimulus apparently was enough to inspire some to jump in.
Yeah, but the question is, was that the right decision? Right. And if we think about, firm deaths and firm births, those are pretty steady until recently, where there's actually more deaths than births. So, that businesses fail. And so if you're kind of putting your eggs in one basket there, again, I don't want to, obviously my story is critical. I can't not be critical. That's what I'm doing. That's the kind of my contribution to the entrepreneurship literature, is to kind of like throw it in this critical space and start like pushing people to think it's a really good idea. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I am. But I also recognize, right, that if you do have $600 and it's the first time you ever had that much money to do something with, that's your shot. So people will, try to make that happen because that's their shot to do it. And that some people, make it.
So before I turn it over to the group, is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you would want to emphasize as we're thinking about, this number of 41% of Black-owned businesses wiped out by COVID, and we're surrounded by this huge desire, by everyone to support the Black community in various ways. What can we learn from the ethnic entrepreneurship literature toward this this goal of supporting and scaling Black-owned businesses, not just us,
Yeah.
but everyone who's thinking about this issue right now. And I
Yeah,
think
well,
one of the contributions that you're making is to really think about what this pathway, why people go down this pathway, and understand the risks and the alternative, the opportunity costs.
yeah. So one of the things is I think it's really great that you are going to have someone kind of visit your group that's talking about the historical business that Black owned businesses were able to do, and quite successfully, right, before it was actually kind of it turned as laws and policies that were exclusive and exclusionary came to pass, and had the effect of basically dismantling businesses in Black areas, Black-owned businesses. So that's like a real thing that I think is very helpful. But it also points to the need to consider race and racial entrepreneurship, or racial social capital, and to consider how race as a classification or a category of identity is different from ethnicity as a category of identity, and how the relationship between ethnicity and race is rarely brought into the entrepreneurship literature. In fact, if you look at the literature, as soon as you talk about an ethnic entrepreneur, you're typically talking about an immigrant or ethnic or recent ethnic minority of some kind. So you start talking right away about particular Asian groups or Latino groups. The ethnic entrepreneurship literature has rarely considered Black entrepreneurship within this literature of ethnic entrepreneurship. And in fact, when they say, I'm going to talk about Black entrepreneurship in this literature, they may call it African American entrepreneurship, because what they're trying to do is signal that African American is similar to an ethnic identity like Korean American, right? So it's not Black, all of a sudden it's whatever, immigrant Black group we're talking about, or African American. And then they point to the Great Migration from the South to the North to escape exclusionary race policies from the South, and they call it the Great Migration. And by calling it the Great Migration, we're also able to kind of like at least say it's similar to an immigrant migration. So they kind of like do that to be able to compare them. But mostly the literature doesn't. And when you're looking at Black entrepreneurship, you might find tons of that research in Black self-employment. And so then there's division in the scholarship between people who talk about entrepreneurship on the one side and small business ownership or self-employment on the other. These two groups of scholars don't talk to each other. And you'll find more on the Black entrepreneurship or Black business in the self-employment and small business work than you do in the entrepreneurship work. So the class and the ethnicity and race relationship in this literature deserves more attention. It's one way to kind of bring them in. It's very similar, by the way, to assimilation. So the idea of assimilation, when we always talk about assimilation, right? What groups do we talk about when we talk about assimilation? So the groups at the turn of the last century, right? We're talking about like the immigrants that were, Irish, or the Germans, or the Italians, or the Mexicans, or the particular Asian groups. And we start talking about like, are they going to assimilate? So that whole literature is not talking about Black Americans. Black Americans are not engaged. They are not being looked at in the assimilation incorporation literature in the same way that they're not being considered in the entrepreneurship literature. And it's because the entrepreneurship literature and the assimilation literature is looking at immigrant incorporation. And so they're much more focused on the ethnic part of the story, and they're not interested in the Black part of the story or the race part of the story, right? So as soon as you start talking about race, you're not talking about assimilation anymore. And when you talk about entrepreneurship, you're talking about business ownership and not So there's problems in the discourse, and also in the debates are quite separate. So I think it's really important to try to put them in. And by the way, you don't have to put them in by saying that they're African American who experienced a great migration. You can just say there's Black entrepreneurship, and there's some ethnic entrepreneurship, and there's some immigrant entrepreneurship. These are all classifications of identity. You can actually also have an ethnic and a race, right, at the same time. And why don't you problematize how social capital might be built on those different kinds of identities, as gender, right? As gender, another category of identity. And so this is where like the importance of intersectionality and entrepreneurship work and assimilation work becomes really critical.
Yeah. I just want to thank you so much, Zulema. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us and to catch up on your work and see you again after all these years.
Yeah.
And you've given us so much to think about. And I think thinking critically about why we might recommend the approaches we do and taking a step back to even think about alternatives is going to be really helpful for us and for our community partners. So,
great. Yeah, well, great. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.